And now, History Showcase and the Muskegon County Museum in Michigan study the historical significance of the Hackley House.
I'm standing here today on the front porch of the Charles Hackley House, one of the finest Queen Anne houses to be found anywhere in North America, and an integral part of our local history. We hope to show you how the County Museum is undertaking the restoration step by step of this magnificent home. It's the goal of the County Museum to bring it back to its splendor as it appeared in 1890 when Charles Hackley and his wife Julia were residents here. One of the most unique factors in working on this restoration project is not only do we have such a fine example of Victorian architecture in the Hackley House, but it's actually part of a compound. Charles Hackley built the house in conjunction with his best friend and business partner, Thomas Hume. And the house next door was that of Thomas Hume's. Together, directly behind both houses, is the barn that served for both households, where the horses were kept and feed was kept and their carriages and so on. We're in the process of restoring all three buildings to revive this unique Victorian compound.
Now, the first point I'd like to make is that the title of this series, Our Old House, was very carefully chosen. The restoration of the buildings at the Hackley and Hume site is very much a community project. These homes are important to us because of the influence that Charles Hackley and Thomas Hume had on the development of this community for the 19th and the 20th century, and the support that has been received that has allowed us to do the restoration has very much been community-wide, county-wide, and I feel that this project is very much ours, all of ours, as citizens in this region. Charles Hackley came to Muskegon just before the Civil War. At that time, it was a sleepy little town of less than 10,000 people. Over the next 25 years, the city and the county would literally explode in economic size, population, and importance to Western Michigan. This was because of lumbering. By 1880, Charles Hackley had amassed a fortune of over $12 million. And from 1890 until the time of his death in 1905, he would return over half of that fortune, $6 million, back to the citizens of Muskegon through a series of philanthropic projects which have increased the quality of life up to the present day. Now, how and why did lumber barons like Charles Hackley begin to amass such great fortunes throughout the Muskegon region? Well, the answer very simply is white pine. Throughout the 19th century, Michigan, which had been largely unexplored and bypassed in the western migration of the United States, contained thousands of acres of white pine. Down here in Muskegon, right in the heart of that white pine territory, we had a natural waterway system with the Muskegon River that provided transportation to move this product to market. Throughout this area, lumber camps would be set up, the trees cut, and moved down to Muskegon where the sawmills would chop it up into lumber. And as a result, this became a focal point for the economic development of this side of the state. In the summer and fall of the year, lumber barons like Charles Hackley would go out and purchase prime pieces of land that contained the white pine. Working all winter long, the lumberjacks would cut the mighty white pine, and aided by the frozen ground and the snow-covered roads, would skid the sleds of trees and logs down to the riverbank. The winter's worth of cut logs would be stacked at a rollaway, a high bank overlooking the Muskegon River. In the spring, when the river's engorged with the runoff from the winter's snow, a log would be driven out, the logs would all tumble into the river, and the driving, pushing the logs down the river towards Muskegon would begin. river rats would guide the logs down the river. This was an especially dangerous job. Trying to move the logs, keep them on their way down to the mill, avoid log jams, and keep your footing was an extremely hazardous occupation. The logs themselves were each individually marked on the end with log marks. This would allow them to be sorted out in the next phase of the operation. In this manner, millions of board feet of lumber were brought down to Muskegon Lake. Even today, we find logs popping up from the bottom of our rivers and our lakes throughout West Michigan. Once the logs arrived at the mouth of the Muskegon River, emptying into Muskegon Lake, the logs were sorted out by their log marks and set into pens for each individual company. This work was done at the booming pens, a vast complex where hundreds of workers were involved. From the booming pens, an individual company's logs would be tied together and hauled to an individual sawmill across the lake. There, the logs would be lifted up to the second floor of the mill and sawn into the rough-cut lumber. This lumber would be stacked on a dock and shipped to Chicago by means of a sailing ship. Now, throughout this whole process, throughout all of this activity, the value of the lumber kept rising. And as a result, millions of dollars were made here in the mills of Muskegon in the latter half of the 19th century. There were numerous lumber barons who amassed large fortunes, but of all of them, Charles Hackley and Thomas Hume were the most successful. By 1887, Charles Hackley, having amassed a huge fortune and being the most influential lumber baron in the region, made the decision to build the home of his dreams for both he and his wife Julia. In 1887, he purchased the last vacant lot of land on Webster Avenue. The next year, they began construction on his home as well as the house next door belonging to his business partner and friend Thomas Hume. Behind the two houses, they began construction of the city barn. We believe this photograph is the earliest known of the area. We can see men on the front porch of the Hackley House that we believe are painters putting the finishing touches on the Hackley House. In 1889, Mr. Hackley's home was complete, and he and his wife Julia moved in. The house design was a strong Queen Anne style with a heavy influence of an exotic design called Moorish Revival. Charles and Julia Hackley would live in the house until their deaths in 1905. They both died a short period apart, and at that point, the house was then passed into the hands of their adopted daughter, Erie Hackley. Erie lived in the house off and on up through sometime in 1921. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, after Erie had moved west, the Hackley House was rented out to a series of families. Those families, in turn, sometimes rented out individual rooms in the house. There are residents still living here in Muskegon County who remember renting rooms and living in the Hackley House during this period.
History Showcase will continue in a moment.